The most important job, the world's toughest job, but also the world's most important job. Not just moms, but obviously fathers as well. We are in a series called God's Greatest Passion. So we've been talking about evangelism and salvation and invitation and things like that. It's really obvious if you study the Bible or if you learn about the character of Jesus. His greatest passion is human beings. If you're a follower of Jesus, then you love human beings. You become like him, you become transformed into who he is, and that's your passion too. That's your mission. And I feel like God has been teaching me consistently for years and years and years that children is one of his greatest passions too. Children are so precious to him, and he cares a lot about them. He wants to see them grow up and to become these spiritual champions, these followers of Jesus. And it is tough. If you have a child in your life in any degree, especially if you're a parent, it's tough, and God knows that. And so we're just going to talk about why, particularly why at Daylight Church, why I feel like God wants children to be a centerpiece for this ministry, and how an underlying mission of Daylight Church is to help people become followers of Jesus. And that includes children. And we want to help children also become followers of Jesus. And so it is a tough job, no doubt about that. There is a proverb in the Bible, in Proverbs 14:14, and it says, "Where there are no oxen, the manger is clean, but abundant crops come by the strength of the ox." So basically what this is saying is, if you don't have oxen in your stable, anybody have oxen here? No. If you don't have oxen in your stable, then you don't have to clean up after them. You don't have to take care of them. You don't have to feed them or water them or anything like that. But you don't have any crops. You can't work your fields. When I read this proverb, I think about children's ministry. Like, it's tough, okay? It's tough to deal with them, like these tiny human beings who can be kind of annoying and like super demanding and needy. But when you think about it over the long-term spectrum, it's an extremely effective ministry to invest in. And whenever I think about tough children's ministry, I think, like, I teach the elementary level kids, but people like Kaylee and Molly DeMoss and Ellen, they do the nursery. And the nursery is just a whole nother level of children's ministry. But it's so important and so valuable. I talked to Molly a little bit about children's ministry, and she said, "Liz, no nursery, no church." I'm like, yeah. That's exactly right. Can you imagine if you didn't have any nursery right now? You'd have kids wandering all over the place, and it'd just be really disruptive. So let's look at some more reasons why kids ministry is important. Frederick Douglass said, "It's easier to build strong children than repair broken men." It just makes sense. Children's ministry is a bottom-up approach instead of a top-down. Starting with adults, that's fine. And am I saying that ministry to adults is pointless? Absolutely not. But children's ministry, this just shows how children's ministry is important. I read a book a few years ago called Transforming Children into Spiritual Champions. And it was written by this researcher called George Barna. And this is what he says in his book. He says, "If you want to have an impact on the world, you do that by investing in people. If you want to maximize that impact, invest in those people while they are young." And he also writes, he does extensive research on many different types of ministries. And he says, "Having devoted more than 2 decades of my life and all of my professional skills to studying and working with ministries of all types, I'm now convinced that the greatest hope for the local church lies in raising godly children. That's something to think about. That's something that church leadership and congregation needs to really consider and to think of, like, well, how can I do that? How can I invest in that? So these truths are things that God has been showing me a lot. There was one time that I was on a plane and I was going on a mission trip with my campus ministry, and I sat by this random person on the plane, and this guy it turns out he was the CEO of an IT company, and he was from India, and started talking to him. He was a practicing Hindu, and I said, okay, well, where are you going to? What are you up to? He said, well, I'm just on a business trip and blah, blah, blah. He said, well, what are you doing? I said, well, I'm on a mission trip with a Christian group of people. And then that started a conversation. And something really interesting that I'll always remember him saying was, he said when he was a really young boy, his father was stationed in Sri Lanka. And there were people ministering there, I think missionaries or something, and they were reaching out to the children in the area. And he told me that he not only just has vague memories of this, he says they're not vague, fuzzy memories. These are extremely clear, very vivid memories of the stories of Jesus. He still remembers that. He's probably in his 40s. But even those memories of Jesus are still with him today, even though he's practicing another religion. So those moments stay with children for years and years and years. I think a lot of people have this idea that, like, oh, they're really young and they won't remember much. Well, that's not true. God really showed me that day on that plane ride that it's important. Let's look at a biological reason that we do children's ministry. So the human brain is just fascinating. I've always been interested in that. But the way the human brain develops is if you look at a picture of a brain of a child around 6 months old, you'll see these neuropaths. And they're kind of crossing over areas of the brain, and they're just pretty simple. And that means that they're beginning to take in information, right? And then if you look at a child's brain developing at 6 years old, it's so many more neuropaths have sprouted, basically. And they're crisscrossing each other, and it's this matted mess of neuropaths. And that means that they're learning so much information, and they're just holding on to it. They're retaining. This is how we get the phrase children are sponges, because they literally take in information like crazy. And then if you look at the human brain at about 14 years old, what do you think happens? Do you think there's more neuropaths or less neuropaths? I hear a lot of people saying yes. Yeah, less. You're right. So what happens is the child starts to hold on to information that is useful and regular and repeated, and they let go of information that they don't use ever. And so this is at 14 years old, right? That indicates, and based on research by George Barna, at around the age of 13, a child has already established their morality and values and concepts of truth, basically their worldview, okay? A lot at 13, that's really young, 12 or 13. I think a lot of people think, well, when you're 18, you go to college, then that's when you decide what you believe. Well, research and based on the biology and the development of the human brain, they made that decision years and years ago, and they just get to live out the decision that they made a long time ago. So this is why we do children's ministry. Let's look at a biblical reason. In the Bible, all throughout Scripture, God says many times and he expresses how children are valuable. One of the first things he said to human beings was, okay, guys, get busy and start cranking out the kids, right? That's one of the first things he said because he knows the value of children. Jesus really loved children. He was the guy who started the children's ministry movement. And I think a lot of people might be familiar with the story of how Jesus is teaching and he's surrounded by adults. And all of these kids start coming up to him. And the disciples tell him, no, go away, children. Children weren't very valuable in his society, right? But Jesus said, no, right here. He said, let them come to me. Let the children come to me. Don't stop them. For the kingdom of God belongs to those who are like these children. This is from Luke 15:6. The interesting thing is it's not just in the book of Luke, but this story is in Matthew and Mark and Luke and John. This story is in all of the accounts of the life of Jesus. Not all stories make it into every gospel. So this is significant, right? So Jesus himself, he loved children. And this tells you a lot about the character of Jesus. Jesus was lively, he was humble, he was honest, he was simple, he was humorous, he was joyful, he was basically a kid, right? Jesus was probably the guy at Thanksgiving who was playing with the kids on the floor. That's what I imagine when I think about Jesus and kids. And I even, there are moments in my life where, for example, I was at a prayer meeting one night, and Siler Hussman comes up to me, and he says, Liz, tag, you're it. And I think, no, I'm not going to chase you around right now. And every time that happens, I feel the Lord, tugging me. It's like Jesus says, Liz, kind of like that. And I imagine that Jesus would instantly play with the kids. And that's just who he is. And that's who he's teaching me to be more and more every day. And so I'm like, all right, I'll chase you around, even though I really don't want to. But once I step out and I start walking as Jesus would walk, I'm like, yeah, of course. Why wouldn't I, play and chase Siler Hussman around? He's awesome, by the way. You need to hang out with Siler Hussman if it's possible. Another place in the Bible, Jesus talks about this farmer that scatters seed. I think maybe HL talked about this story, but he scatters seed in all of these areas. Some of the seed falls on rocky ground, and some of the seed falls on very shallow ground, and the seeds start sprouting a little bit, but it's not deep enough, and so it can't grow. And other areas, the seeds grow, but they're choked out by the thorns. And then Jesus says, on other seeds, they fall on good soil. He says this, still other seed fell on fertile soil, and they produced a crop that was 30, 60, and even 100 times as much as had been planted. I really think that children are good soil. If you want to teach kids, if you want to instill values in them, if you want to teach them truth, if you want to teach them about the person of Jesus, they're good soil. It's going to yield good, amazing crops. There's another verse, pretty famous. You probably know it. Oh, can't really see it. Direct your children onto the right path, and when they are older, they will not leave it. Proverbs 22:6. So that's a basic biblical principle. And I understand that, I've known parents who take their kids to church and they teach them the right things and they do all the things that a parent needs to do, but maybe one of their children decides when they get older that they're not going to continue going to church. And that's so hard. This Bible verse does not say Well, if you do your job and if you're a good parent, then your kid is 100% guaranteed to walk down this path that you've shown them. No, that's not what it says. That verse is not meant to make any parent feel guilty about the choices of their child. When your child grows up, they become their own person, and that's their own decision. And I know that is tough. And that's something I think about a lot. And I just pray, and I have, with a sober mind and just this realization that I need God, and that parents, that we need God in order for our children to stay on the right path. But here are I want to talk about partnership with children's ministry and parents. So this is a chart, and on the side here, this represents how many hours per year, okay? So at church, this little blue segment, this is 45 hours. Children spend an average of 45 hours at church every year. At school, it's about 1,200 hours. And with parents, you take the cake. It's an average about 3,000 hours, or a little more than that, right? So I think what I don't want to happen at Daylight Church is for all the responsibility to fall on the children's ministers, okay? Because that's imbalanced. We only get 45 hours per year, okay? But in that sense, we only get 45 hours, so it's our responsibility, it's my responsibility every week to make sure that hour counts, and that hour matters. At the same time, I want to partner. I want children's ministry to not just be the children's leaders and the people at church, but also a connection with the parents too. Okay, we're realizing a lot of leaders in children's ministry in the past decade has realized parents' role. I think it's really obvious, their role. And parents, we want to help you, and we want to know what we can do to support you to help raise your kids, because it's really important. And I'm pretty young. I'm not married. I'm not a parent. I hope to be someday. So I feel like I can't give any really good parenting advice, but I was a substitute teacher for several months. Oh, man, what a ride. Being a substitute teacher at an elementary school level, I think a way to describe it is like being in a small room with 25 Buddy the Elves all day long. And not only that, you have to teach these people things about things. You have to teach them how to count and how to add numbers. You have to teach them what color red and blue make. You have to teach them that water and electricity are not friends. Just basic things that you would never think about. You have to make sure that they know what country they live in. One day I was in a class and I just asked, guys, what country do we live in? And everybody said, America. And there was one boy that said, apartment. I'm like, wow. Your parents didn't teach you about America, huh? So I think substitute teaching has helped me see into the life of a parent on some level, not completely. I'm not there yet. But I feel like I can at least give some direction. And I'm not just talking to the parents, I'm talking to everybody here, to everybody involved in the church. So the first thing is to be available, or to be present. So this reminds me of, has anybody seen the movie Interstellar? Yeah, okay, some people. So I saw this movie, and I will be honest, I absolutely hate the movie. I remember being in the theater and just being so, wanting so badly to leave the theater, but I couldn't because I came with other people in their car. So I was stuck in this theater. And I feel a little embarrassed to say this, but I've lost sleep over thinking about how much I hate this movie. It's ridiculous. And even one time I was on a plane and they started playing Interstellar, and this guy next to me plugs in, he puts on his headphones, and I'm thinking, oh, he doesn't know what he's doing. And so I tap him on the shoulder, and I said, excuse me, have you ever seen this movie before? He said, no. And I said, well, I'm just letting you know that I've seen this movie, and it's a terrible movie, okay? And he was like, okay, thanks, and kind of went back to his movie. Now, I've talked to several people, and there are some people who really think it's a great movie, and that's fine. You can stay in that camp. But I'll stay in my camp, okay, and we can still be friends. But I thought, man, why do I hate this movie so much? And I thought of two big things. The first thing is that it is stressful beyond all reason, okay? On the clinically insane level, it is so stressful to me. I'm a pretty sensitive, emotional person, but I'm pretty peaceful. Things can happen, and I'm kind of stressed out on the inside, but my reaction is okay, calm and cool. But this movie just shook me. It almost shook me to my core. It was ridiculous, the amount of catastrophes that happened over and over and over again. If you haven't seen it, I don't want to give any spoilers. I don't want to ruin the movie for you. I think it ruined itself, but whatever. Just a horrible thing happens. They go into space, into this wormhole, and they go on this planet, and something bad happens, and it's awful, and there's organ music in the background, and that's just really stressful, and I just couldn't handle it. So that's the first reason I don't like it. The second reason is the relationship with the father and his daughter. He's a really distant father, and then he finds out that he has a chance to go on this space mission to find another inhabitable planet in another dimension of space. And he says, okay, yeah, I'll go. And then I remember watching the scene of him talking to his daughter and telling his daughter that he's leaving, and it's just awful because she's so torn up about it. And the heavy thing is that this particular space mission he'll be gone for the rest of their lives. He's not coming back to Earth because that's how intense it is for different scientific reasons that you'll probably find out if you watch it. But she is so torn up. And it's he's in her bedroom. He says, okay, goodbye forever. And I'm just this better be good. He's leaving his daughter forever. This mission better be worth it. And I found out that it wasn't worth it. Maybe everybody else has different opinions. That's fine. You can have your opinions, and you can continue liking the movie, and I'll be your friend, jerk. But so let's talk about another father, okay? This is my dad, and he's just awesome. He's awesome at being a father. And I went home for Thanksgiving, and it was me and my parents and my brother sitting around at the dinner table, and my parents were reminiscing about all the wonderful memories of raising children. And all of them were kind of hard. They talked about how it was hard to get you guys up and get ready for preschool, and then I had to be at work, and your dad had to take you, and then if I was still at work, then he had to come back and get you, when I was there. My mom also told me a really embarrassing story of when I was 3 years old. I was sleeping in the car, and I got really fussy, and my mom picked me up and held me in the front seat, and then I just started peeing all over, just everywhere. I'm just wow, I'm so sorry. And it was a huge ordeal for my parents, that situation. And even after all of those things that they had to deal with with raising me and my brother. After all of the talk, my dad said, I loved every second of it. Like, and he meant it genuinely. He's just that kind of person. Like, he's a very genuine, passionate person. And another thing about my dad is he loves guitar. He loves music. He plays in a jazz orchestra, a swing orchestra. And he's been playing guitar ever since he was 6 years old. He taught himself, and that's kind of his lifeline. And there was a time when my brother and I were really little, and he kept getting like appointments in Nashville for like recording deals. And so he'd be gone a lot. He'd like be in Nashville a lot. And I remember my mom didn't like it. And I remember their conversations being really tense. And my dad ended up, even though he absolutely loves music and he wanted to pursue, a career in that, and he could have been known, right? He could have been known for his talent and his passion, but he said, okay, I'll stop. I'll stop going to Nashville so I can be here with you and so I can be here with Elizabeth and Reed, because you guys are what matter more to me than going after that. That's what it takes. That's what this job requires, is to be present, to forsake. There's always something else that you can go after. But God has given you, whatever it is, God has given you a calling on your life. And you need to realize that, right? So be present. Second thing is take your kids places. Do I mean go on vacation to the Grand Canyon? That's a good idea. That's not really what I mean right here. What I mean is, I think a lot of Christians have done a good job of condensing God into just a lifestyle, right? Oh, you're a follower of Jesus? Well, you have to do this, and you have to live this way, and that's it, right? That's a lot of our Christian culture, I feel like. But that's kind of like taking them to the playground at your local park and just letting them have fun on the jungle gym. But there's the Grand Canyon. Okay, God is so much more than just a lifestyle and a way of life. There's one of my favorite poems is by Wilbur Rees. It's called $3 Worth of God. And it says, I would like to buy $3 worth of God, please, but not enough to explode my soul or disturb my sleep, but just enough to equal a warm cup of milk or a snooze in the sunshine. I don't want enough of God to make me love a poor man or pick beets with a migrant. I want ecstasy, not transformation. I want warmth of the womb, not a new birth. I want a pound of the eternal in a paper sack. I would like to buy $3 worth of God, please. Are we lost in God, or are we buying $3 worth of God? Because God is so much more than $3. I was a camp counselor one summer, and I had this camper. One night we were talking by the fireside kind of about God and stuff, and I said, look up, you see those stars in the sky? She said, yeah. I said, God is bigger than all of that. He's bigger than the entire outer space. And she was like, whoa. Like she was genuinely enamored at God in that moment. And at the end of that week, we like to ask our campers what they learned at camp. And like some kids say, well, I learned that Jesus died for my sins and he forgives me. Well, I learned that you should treat others the way you want to be treated. And then I asked that girl, I said, well, what did you learn? She said, I learned that God is big. Good answer. Like, she really learned it. It's not just a phrase that she picked up, right? She took that knowledge and she had it in her heart and she believed it. And she was enamored by it. I was at a church service kind of recently, And the pastor was talking about how when he was in children's church, he heard all about this relationship with God all his life. But he said, I never really experienced that. I heard people talk about it all the time, and it wasn't real for him. I don't want that. And I think you agree that you don't want that for our kids here. That was my deal. Because when we have a behavior-based approach, I think a lot of people have this idea that children's ministry is kind of like, we'll teach the kids to behave well, teach them to do the right thing and teach them about the 10 Commandments and all this stuff. That stuff is important, but it can't be the driving force of children's ministry. Because when it happens, there's either two results. Either you have prideful, self-righteous people, or you have people who are frustrated that they can't meet the expectations. I kind of fell into the prideful camp. Pretty self-righteous person. I've always been a goody two-shoes. I was the kid on the playground who told the other kids to stop saying shut up because it was a cuss word, okay? That's not the result that we need, okay? Jesus was against people like me. Jesus was against people like the Pharisees and the religious leaders who are proud of how they follow rules. That's not what it's about. It's part of it. Of course, you follow God and you live the way that he wants, what the word says. But that's not what it's about. It's about experiencing God's love above everything else. It's about thinking about how big he is. He's bigger than outer space. It's about really experiencing the presence and the power and the love of Jesus. And as a children's pastor, if I don't experience that love, if I don't have a real relationship with Jesus, how can I show that to the kids, right? How can I do that? It's impossible. It's kind of like, you guys have seen these posts on Facebook, right? It's these recipe videos. And you watch the video and you're like, oh, that looks awesome. That looks easy to do. I want to do that. And so maybe you'll share it or you'll save it on your profile. It doesn't matter how many times you watch the video. It doesn't matter how many times you read the recipe or go over the methods. You can even memorize the whole entire recipe. But until you actually put the food in your mouth, you haven't experienced the food. We need to experience God, right? Enough memorizing, enough thinking about it, right? The head knowledge needs to come down here. And we need to be able to do that in order to lead children to do that, right? Children just want to experience God. It's that simple. It's the love of God that they're hungry for. And Paul writes in Ephesians, and he's praying. He's writing a letter to the church in Ephesus, and his prayer is, and may you have the power to understand, as all God's people should, how wide, how long, how high, how deep his love is. May you experience the love of Christ, though it is too great to understand fully. Then you will be made complete with all the fullness of life and the power that comes from God. Okay, this was Paul, one of the greatest church leaders in history. This was his desire for the church. That's God's desire for us too, is that we would experience, right? It's big, it's long, it's wide, it's deep, right? That seems like a pretty vague concept, I know, but I feel like all you have to do is just be hungry, right? You just have to ask God. Like, I actually told him, I was talking to God last week, and I was honest. I said, God, I'm just not satisfied in you. Like, I was completely honest with him. I said, I feel like I'm chasing other things, and I want other things, and I'm not really hungry for you. And because of that, I'm not really satisfied. But if we experience God's love, it says we will be made complete with all the fullness and power and love of God that he has to offer. That's what I want for Daylight Kids. That's what God wants. And this is a picture to close. This is a picture of a girl who came to church maybe a few months ago. And she came to Daylight Kids for the first time. And after she went home, and she was sitting in the back seat of the car, and her mom turned around and glanced at her, and she was in the back seat praying like this, just by herself, without any adult instruction or coaching. She was like this, talking to Jesus. Okay, and this girl, she's 4 years old. Okay, she already has a relationship with Jesus that's her own. She owns it. She's autonomous. That's what we want. That's what God wants for children, for everybody, in every ministry, right? You need to experience God's love.